Hello and welcome to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmstead. As you can see, today's topic is World War I, or the Great War. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Now, you got it? Let's get started. Now, this is the Great War. World War I, the war to end all wars. Well, so we thought. Not so much. So let's talk about some long-term causes of World War I. Now, if you're hoping here for a bunch of battle talk, I'm not doing that. In fact, I would suggest go on YouTube, look up various videos about the war. I would suggest Crash Course, or even better for the actual battles, a YouTube series called Oversimplified, who do a great job of explaining in quite humorous animated terms a lot of different wars. Nonetheless, here we go. The causes, the long-term causes of World War I. And to break it down, I got a little acronym for you, the main reasons, where main is the acronym. Now, ultimately, this battle comes down to a battle between two sides, two parties. The Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Now, in 1870, the balance of power in Europe was upset by a decisive Prussian victory in the Franco-Prussian War. Bismarck feared French revenge and negotiated treaties to isolate France, but he also feared Russia. So in 1879, the Dual Alliance was formed, Germany and Austria, because Bismarck sought to thwart Russian expansion. In 1881, the Triple Alliance was fully formed, where Italy joined with Germany and Austria, and Italy sought support for its imperialistic ambitions in the Mediterranean and Africa. By 1880, France would court Russia, and the two became allies. Now, after 1891, Britain was the only non-aligned power and joined what they called the Splendid Isolation. But in 1902, Britain sought out a Japanese agreement to what they call the benevolent neutrality in order to counter possible Russian threats in India, known as the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. This was the end of Britain's splendid isolation. This would lead to what's called the Triple Entente, which is 1907, Britain, France, and Russia. It was formed to check the power of the Triple Alliance. Not truly a formal alliance, but one mainly done on principle. So the A here is the alliances part of Maine. Then we have the Anglo-German arms race. So militarism. Militarism led to a belief of the inevitability of a general European war. Germany overtook Great Britain industrially by the 1890s and began modern armament during the Second Industrial Revolution. British policy was to have its larger fleet, to have a fleet larger than the combined fleets of any two rival nations. In 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany began to expand Germany's navy to protect the growing international trade and colonialism. By World War I, both Britain and Germany possessed dreadnoughts, these new super battleships with an awesome firing range and tremendous power. So there began an arms race between Great Britain and Germany. That's the militarism part of it. Again, this is largely a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. Also, imperialism. Imperialism, we talked about last time, led to increased tensions between the great powers over Africa and in Asia. And then finally, nationalism that creates kind of the powder keg moment in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, quote unquote, the sick man of Europe, receded from the Balkans, leaving a power vacuum. Pan-Slavism, a nationalist movement, was designed to unite all Slavic peoples, to encourage Serbs and Bosnians and Slovenes and Croats to seek a single political entity in southern Europe. But as the southern Slavs' big brother, the East, Russia, focused on the Balkan territories after its humiliating loss in the Russo-Japanese War. This would lead to two Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913, the Third Balkan War beginning the start of World War I. So all these things are going to be the long-term causes, right? The militarism, military buildup, especially the arms race between Britain and Germany. The alliance system that would form as a mutual defense pact between the Triple Entente and Triple Alliance. The imperialistic rivalries to protect their assets and colonies in Africa and Asia, we talked about in the last lecture. And then finally, this hyper-patriotism, this nationalism, that says, hey, we're better than you because we are, and we're going to prove it to you by taking you over. Now, the more immediate cause, the short-term cause, would occur on June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austrian heir to the throne, was assassinated. There we go. Was assassinated by the Serbian nationalist Princip, who was a member of the ultra-nationalist Serbian Black Hand. Well, Franz Ferdinand was visiting Bosnia and Herzegovina. Kaiser Wilhelm II pledged unwavering support to Austria to punish Serbia, essentially giving him a blank check. Austria made harsh demands on Serbia by requiring Serbia to punish all forms of anti-Austrian sentiment. I mean, can you imagine a nation trying to crack down on every single form of anti-belief systems? Even going so far as to punish colleges and universities for not allowing free speech. Well, these demands were just too harsh. And so on July 28th, Austria will declare war on Serbia. And note, Austria only declares war on Serbia. Now, this is fascinating, of course, because Serbia is a small, tiny, relatively obscure nation in Eastern Europe. And yet this is the powder keg. This is the match that sparks a global war. So, in July 28, 1914, Austria declares war on Serbia, claims Serbia had not adequately accommodated Austria's demands. On July 29th, Austria began bombarding the capital of Serbia, Belgrade. This represents the first military aggression of the war. In response, Russia begins mobilizing its armies against both Austria and Germany. France, in response, begins to mobilize on Germany's western border because it's allies with Russia. On August 1st, Germany declares war on France because it's allied with Austria. On August 3rd, Germany invades Belgium on its way to France. In effect, Germany had taken a little localized war in the Balkans into a world war by attacking both Belgium and France. In response, France declares war on Germany, and on August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany, and because they're allies with Japan, Japan declares war on Germany because they're allies with Britain. In the end, we get two opposing sides. There we go. We have the Central Powers, aka the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and technically Italy. Though Italy's going to switch sides, just give them a year. Then we have the Allied power, aka the Triple Entente, of Britain, France, Russia, a year later, Italy, and much later, the United States. Now, the Western Front of the war. The main plan was known as the Schieffelin Plan. This was Germany's military plan to invade France through Belgium, defeat France very quickly, 6 weeks, by sweeping around Paris and then redeploy to the east to defeat Russia. Honestly, it's a pretty good plan. It seemed reasonable. The thought was you could steamroll through Belgium, quickly reach Paris, take it out, and then go focus on your eastern front on Russia while the British are still beginning to, prepare. Unfortunately, the Belgians held up the process. They offered surprising resistance to Germany's invasion and slowed down the German offensive into France. The Russians quickly mobilized more quickly than the Germans thought and began attacking eastern side of Germany, which forced Germany to divide its forces there instead. France and British counterattack was then decisive in halting the German invasion. So the plan to end the war quickly or for a quick German victory failed miserably. What this led to instead was a prolonged stalemate on the Western Front, aka trench warfare. Now, again, I'm not going to go into any battles here. The big part here, though, is that World War I was incredibly brutal. I mean, massively brutal. And I think the easiest, albeit oversimplified way to explain it is they are using 20th century technology courtesy of the Second Industrial Revolution, but they're still using 19th century battle tactics, which were stand in front of each other and shoot. Well, that made a little bit of sense, I guess, when you had muskets and single-shot rifles. But World War I, we now have full-fledged machine guns that don't stick. They don't jam up. If I move my picture out of the way here, we got tanks that did not exist in any previous war. By the end of the war, by 1917, we have airplanes for the first time being used in war. And so both sides of the war, the Triple Entente and Triple Alliance, the Allied and Central Powers, they tried to adapt, I guess, because they realized that I'm not just talking thousands of people dying, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of people dying. For example, let me give a couple of quick examples of this. The Battle of Verdun in February 1916. In this one battle, France lost 540,000 men. Germany lost 430,000 men. All told combined, both sides lost 870,000 men. That was in February 1916. In July of 1916, at the Battle of Somme, Britain lost 420,000. France lost 200,000. Germany lost 650,000. In other words, more than 1 million men died in this one battle, the Battle of Somme, in July 1916. And so very quickly, both sides realized stand in front of each other and shoot is not going to work. When you have machine guns, you have chemical weapons like mustard gas, you have tanks, you have flamethrowers, and eventually you have planes. So on the Western Front, what they did was they started using what's called trench warfare. Basically dig big ditches and then hide in those. Then every so often, your commanding officer will tell you to lift your head over top of it and start shooting across the field toward the opposing side, also dug in trenches. And then occasionally, every so often, your commanding officer will tell you, charge! And you will jump up over the edge of that trench wall and rush across into no man's land and get gunned down and killed. If you're lucky, you may take the other trench and force your enemy to retreat back 100 yards or 200 yards, where they will dig a new trench. And I kid you not, over the course of 4 years of war, the battle lines on the Western Front between Germany and France, they moved no more than a few miles either direction. So the Allied powers would gain some ground for a while, and then they'd be pushed back. And they would gain some ground, and the Germans would push them back. And the battle line never really moved more than a handful of miles throughout the course of the war, and yet millions upon millions of people would die. And those who did die were suffering from disease that was rampant. In these ditches, they were often filled with water, so you're literally standing in water. You see the picture on the screen now of what's called trench foot, where people's foot begin literally rotting away from being wet all the time. Rats would crawl around in these and nibble on you throughout the days and nights. During the winter months, it's cold and icy. And all of this is being done because they did not adapt to 20th century technology in their battle planning. And again, I want to reiterate this. These are machine guns. These are tanks. These are airplanes by the end of the war. Poison gas, including mustard gas. By the way, fun fact, if you want to protect yourself from mustard gas, obviously have a gas mask like you see pictured on the screen, or it is said that you can pee on your shirt or a rag and put that rag over your mouth, and the methane from your urine will actually protect you from the effects of mustard gas. I don't want to try it, but a little fun side fact. Also is the German U-boats, the submarines that were instrumental for the Germans in their navy, because at this point in history, we don't have radar yet to detect them. And then finally, Zeppelins, the blimps, that will be used by Germany to bomb London and other civilian targets. And then finally, another new invention, radio. Wireless technology that will help troops communicate with each other. Again, all this 20th century technology, but they're still largely relying on 19th century battle tactics. Now, the Eastern Front was very different. On the Eastern Front, two major generals will dominate, including von Hindenburg of Germany and Ludendorff, which, by the way, you might have heard of von Ludendorff if you watched the original Wonder Woman movie. They are going to be tasked with invading Russia and trying to turn the tide of the war in the East. Now, to be fair, the Russians were poorly organized. They suffered horrific casualties. And while the Western Front was noted for being trench warfare, the Eastern Front was very much pushing the battle lines deep into enemy territory. Now, in December 1917, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and Vladimir Lenin, following the Bolshevik Revolution, will take Russia out of the war, but was forced to give Germany a quarter of Russian territory. Now, what I want to point out here is that in 1917, Germany makes three what I'll call Hail Marys, to explain it more loosely here. You see, by 1917, Germany was seemingly on the ropes. They were fighting a two-front war. They're fighting, the British and the French on the west side, and they're fighting the Russians on the east side. And the reality was, they were losing. And one of the big issues was they had stopped using their U-boats to attack civilian ships. So here's a picture of one of the U-boats here. Now, very famously, back in 1915, the Germans were using their U-boats to blockade Britain, which is traditional in most wars. However, they sank a passenger ship called the Lusitania that killed 1,200 passengers, including 128 Americans. This outraged Americans. Now, the Germans said that this passenger ship was carrying war supplies, and therefore it justified its need to torpedo it and to sink it to prevent Britain from getting supplies. Now, on the one hand, it's atrocious what the Germans did here. They killed 1,200 innocent people. But the Germans were right. They were smuggling ammunition on this passenger ship, which is also breaking the terms of war. In response to this, the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson issued an ultimatum that said, Germany, if you keep using your U-boats to attack civilian ships, the U.S. is going to be forced to enter the war. And for the most part, the next couple of years, Germany would back down a little bit. But that was 1915. By 1917, however, this was no longer the case. By 1917, Germany was in trouble. And so in 1917, Germany launched what I would refer to in football terms as three Hail Marys. Three long shots that, if they all work, may turn the tide of the war, but if they don't, it's essentially a huge risk, but possible huge reward. Hail Mary number one was trying to get Russia out of the war. Because if they could get Russia out of the war, Germany could have to they could move all their resources to fight the western side against the British and the French. So what they did is they went into Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, and ferried on a train Vladimir Lenin, a revolutionary, back to Russia. And the goal was, they put him on a train, took him all the way through through Germany, not Japan. They put Lenin on a train, let him go, push him safely through Germany, and basically dumped him in Russia. The idea was that he would lead a revolution, to overthrow the Russian government, and then, because he's an avowed socialist, he would take Russia out of the war. Now, there's a little more to the story. It's more complicated than that, and we will talk about that in a future lecture. But that Hail Mary works. They get Lenin, they take him across Germany, and he will, as they dump it into Russia, he will lead a revolution, and Russia will exit the war in 1917. The second Hail Mary was the resumption of what was called unrestricted U-boat warfare. In other words, they began seeing passenger ships they suspected of ferrying ammunition from the United States. Well, sure enough, they will do so. Now, the fear, of course, was we would join the war, we in the United States. So they launched Hail Mary number 3, which is dubbed the Zimmerman Telegram. Now, the Zimmerman Telegram was a supposedly secret telegram that Germany was going to send to Mexico. And the idea was they were going to propagate that Mexico should attack the United States. And the idea of this was we would be so focused on the Mexican invasion that we would not be able to join the war despite our promise to do so if Germany resumed U-boat warfare. Now, the problem with this is a couple-fold. Number one, Mexico was in no condition to attack the United States because they were engaged in their own civil war known as the Mexican Revolution that occurred from 1910 through 1921. They were in no condition to do so. Now, Germany hoped that this could be avoided or overcome because they promised that if Mexico did this and Germany won the war, Germany then would help Mexico get all the American Southwest back to Mexico. Problem number 2 with this, however, was the telegram was intercepted by the British, who then sent it to the United States, who then published it in newspapers. So it wasn't very, very secretive. And this would cause outrage among Americans, leading the United States to, well, join the war. It will incense the American people, and so Hail Mary number 2 and 3 will backfire spectacularly, and the United States is going to enter the war. Now, this war was unlike any other. This was what we refer to as total war. Total war means that it's not just the men fighting abroad, but it's also the women, the children, the men left behind fighting at home. And there's a scene of Lusitania right there, by the way. This was a total war where men, women, children, where the men were just fighting the war, but they were also fighting at home, building stuff, working in the factories nonstop, using propaganda to drum up support. And the American involvement in the war was largely led by our business leaders. In fact, people like J.P. Morgan, owner of both Chase Bank, or founder of Chase Bank, and also who owned U.S. Steel, stood to lose a whole lot of money if the Allied powers lost, thus pushing our president to enter the war. Japan will also join the side, hoping that they will reap the rewards of the victors should they win the war, which they will, and also take the opportunity to invade China. How do we end this war? Well, 1917, we have the Balfour Declaration, where Arabs and Jews in Palestine were promised autonomy if they would be joining the Allies. The British declared sympathy for the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, though this new policy seemed to contradict earlier British support for Arab nationalism. And of course, the other big diplomatic response was, of course, Woodrow Wilson, U.S. President's 14 points. It was a plan to end the war along liberal democratic lines that would include abolishing secret treaties, freedom on the high seas, removing economic tariffs, reduction in armaments, promising independence and self-determination to oppressed minority groups, Poles, Czechs, millions of whom lived in Germany and Austria-Hungary. Adjustment of colonial claims that will benefit both native peoples and the colonizers. German evacuation of Russia. Restoration of Belgium. Adjustment of Italy's borders along ethnic lines. Autonomy of non-Turkish parts for the Turkish Empire. And of course, the 14th point, the biggest one. A new international legislative body, governing body, called the League of Nations, that will allow nations to come together and talk about their differences before resulting in war. which of course is never going to work because the U.S. is never going to join it because Woodrow Wilson blundered the decision by never involving the Congress, who would have to approve this decision. So how does it end? Well, it ends with the Versailles Treaty in 1919 officially. Now, the war is over in 1918 in November, but we get the big peace accord in 1919, once again in Paris. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is who's invited to this peace talk? It's the British, the French, the US, and the Italians. The big four are going to gather together to hammer out a peace treaty. Who's not there? The Germans. And so in this peace treaty, the main antagonist, as far as our concern is, the Germans, aren't even there to negotiate this peace deal. Instead, they are just forced to accept it, whatever is said. And many will point out, especially historians, scholars, intellectuals, economists, that this will all but guarantee World War II, because in this peace treaty, we will get the League of Nations, proposed by Woodrow Wilson, that will fail. The Germans will lose their colonies and lose more land. It will limit the German military and navy. But the biggest thing here is that the Germans are forced to accept total guilt for this war. It's known as Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany is forced to accept complete guilt for the entirety of this war and forced to pay financial reparations. This is a death sentence to Germany, and as the famed economist John Maynard Keynes said, he basically prophesied this in 1919, this war guilt clause, along with reparations, is going to guarantee World War II. Because Germany is going to be so put down and hammered down with no hope of repaying this debt. It will so cripple their economy and devastate their people that a dictator is going to rise and we're going to have World War II, just for how devastating this treaty is to Germany as a nation. It disregards their sovereignty, disregards their rise to power in the 19th century. But how do we conclude this? Well, it does redraw the borders, as you see on the map on the screen. Germany and Russia were not included in the treaty discussions. The United States is going to return to isolationism. And the League that was promised to fix things is going to ultimately be a mere shadow of its intention, in part because the U.S. won't join it. John Maynard Keynes is going to predict that we will have World War II because of the economic conditions that are strapping Germany and holding them down, holding them back, and collapsing their economy, devastating their people. One of the other big issues, though, is, of course, just the dead. There are massive casualties. Over 10 million soldiers are dead. 10 million civilians are dead. Another 30 million will die of an influenza Spanish flu outbreak following the war. 15 million more are going to die in the Russian Revolution, we'll talk about later. But the war would try to promote greater social equality, blurring class distinctions, lessening the gap between rich and poor. It also would end long-standing royal dynasties, including the Habsburgs, who were removed from Austria, that had been there for 500 years. The Romanovs in Russia were removed, had been there for 300 years. The Hohenzollern dynasty in Germany that had been there were removed for the last 300 years. The Ottoman Empire that had been around for 500 years was destroyed. And the political map of Europe was redrawn. But what the World War ultimately did was set the stage for a very uneasy 20-year period that would see the Russians turn to communism, the Italians turn to fascism, and the Germans turn to Nazism. I think I might have said that wrong. The Italians turn to fascism. The Germans turn to Nazism, which is a form of fascism. And of course, what we're going to see is a Second World War just 20 years later. But that's for later discussion, so until then, take care and bye-bye.